Today, I want to talk about stories that we live by and how we might make decisions to choose a better story. In April, several of us from the Society participated in the Revolutionary Love Conference virtually. I found myself especially focused on one challenge that a speaker laid down. Brian McLaren asked whether people, secular and religious, could come together and create an educational curriculum to help our children learn to live in accord with our basic values, especially honoring the worth and dignity of every person and seeking both love and justice in the world. So I went looking for what he'd already written about this topic, and I found the book that I read earlier, Cory and the Seventh Story, which the authors describe as a story for all ages. It's written by Brian McLaren and Gareth Higgins, with illustrations by Heather Lynn Harris, and you can get a physical or ebook version from your favorite independent bookseller. They also have a corollary book, The Seventh Story for Adults, which I recommend. And in the same week that happened, I worked with several others to write a resolution for our National Federation of Ethical Societies, the American Ethical Union, for consideration at this year's Ethical Assembly of Societies. It's about a renewal of our commitment as an ethical movement to the idea of a culture of peace. When the United States was founded, there were actually some people who called for creating a cabinet level Department of Peace, and that was never implemented. Instead, we got a Department of War by itself, which became later a Department of Defense. But nothing at the national level to both examine the root causes of war and violence abroad and in international relations, but also domestically, and to work to end those root causes. Also to promote practices that build a lasting peace and the foundation for all. And so these are both on my mind this week as I talk about what stories we choose to follow. I want to look again at the 6 stories humankind has too often lived by, and then that 7th story. That first story we heard was about domination, us ruling over them. In children's language, it's about being the boss of others. Psychology and neuroscience tell us that when we perceive a threat in the world, when we see them as a threat to us, a way that our brains have taught us to react is through aggression. But that story doesn't work very well for them. They may rebel. And it doesn't really work that well for us either, because we are afraid of the second story, which is vengeance. That second story was about us overthrowing them. In children's language, getting revenge on those who bossed you around. So often in human history, a revolution has turned into a new domination. When we overturn us and just seek revenge to treat them like we believe they treated us, we perpetuate the system of domination. This too is what psychology and neuroscience tell us our brains want to do in reactions to a threat: more aggression. And that second story doesn't really work that well either. So sometimes instead of violent rebellion, those who want to rebel against domination isolate themselves. That third story is isolation, us apart from them, running away afraid. How many times in our personal lives have we dealt with bullies and other threats by simply trying to run away? And often from a distance, then we talk about how awful those dominators are, or about how awful the rebels are who took their place and became dominators in turn. The psychologists and neuroscientists would call this flight or avoidance. It's another way that our brains are wired to react unthinkingly to any threat. But such changes, but not much changes if we isolate ourselves and simply judge others from afar. Those dominators still dominate. But what happens if it's someone else's fault? Surely we can fix things if we focus on people who are different, people whose customs or language or beliefs are different. And so the fourth story is purification. This is when an us marginalizes and excludes a them. This is when we turn on those who seem different. And this is sometimes called scapegoating. This doesn't work for long either. Those who are targeted by scapegoating suffer from blame and shame, and they feel unsafe, while those who are targeting them actually don't see their problems solved and miss out on the benefits that those treated as scapegoats could have offered. Many religions historically were actually born out of scapegoating and sacrifice. A fifth story is victimization, us defeated by them. In children's language, it's giving up in helplessness. The brain freezes as one possible response to threat. But suffering as an identity doesn't really bring much meaning to life, nor really does it change the situation and the domination. And then there's accumulation. Oh, look, a shiny object. If we gather, oops, sorry, it doesn't look right there. If we gather more than them, or just have more ourselves, maybe we won't feel so bad. And if we have more shiny objects than others do, maybe we can gain a sense of pride and accomplishment and meaning from our objects. But ultimately, this is a distraction. Possessiveness and greed lead to different kinds of domination than raw power and violence, and become themselves a kind of violence. Whether accumulating other nations or accumulating on a personal level more and bigger toys, this really doesn't heal us, nor does it get rid of any of the other stories, which are still operating. All of those stories have within them both a failure to fulfill the deepest desires we have as human beings for mattering, for worth, for being important in this world, for being connected to others. And they also continue to escalate as they ever try harder to work when they really don't work. And why don't they work? They ignore how every human being wants to be recognized for our worth and our dignity, and that every human being actually is interdependent with every other human being and with the earth itself. We think we are in competition and that we are mutually threats to each other, but the biggest threat actually to humanity is in choosing stories that make our lives worse and worse and worse. And that's why we need a seventh story. We need to build together, not fight each other. As Brian McLaren says in one of his books, we need to build things like tables where we could all sit and eat together. And in times when we cannot come together in person, like here, we have virtual tables like where we are today, meeting and seeing faces and putting our minds and hearts together. These 6 stories teach us to devalue our differences and to treat them as threats and excuses for punishment and shame. That the threats of violence today are not what they were when our reaction systems evolved to protect us doesn't seem to have played a part in our cultural evolution. But today, our threats of violence come more from how we treat each other than from actual competition. We need to recognize that cooperation is more the real nature of people than is competition. So what would a different community look like? Let's call it the seventh story. Brian McLaren and others call it reconciliation. Reconciliation, us and them learning to be in right relationship. That is to share power rather than to exercise power one over the other. Sharing power actually increases the total power for everyone, while power of domination decreases the total power because it takes away from some, while not really giving as much power to the dominators as they would love to believe. Sharing power increases the power for everyone so that we can do what we need to do to live good lives. This is the kind of community where we can reach out across isolation to build connection, where we understand that those on the margins are also human equally and have a lot to offer, and that if they're at the same table, everyone is better off. If we were in this new story, we would stress sharing over possession. We'd take responsibility for healing wounds from the past. And in the near term, what reconciliation may mean, instead of everyone already being there, because there's resistance to moving to this, is that some of us have to be for all of us, even if not everyone is there yet. In children's language, this story is about finding joy in belonging to that big, beautiful, hospitable us, one that includes everyone, so that there is no longer a them. It means a world in which we have love and justice and peace. There are other words that have been used for this story. Sometimes we've called it a culture of peace, with the understanding that peace is not really peace without inclusion and justice. We've talked about beloved community in our platform Sundays before, many times. The conference that some of us went to called it revolutionary love, the kind of love that really wants the best life for everyone. Or it might be Gandhi's ahimsa, or nonviolence, which was more than just an absence of violence, but included nonviolent resistance to injustice and considered injustice a kind of violence. What I love about the seventh story is that it calls us to be more fully human than any of the other stories do. We are not reduced to domination for our own gain, to replacing one kind of domination for another, to how we are different from and better than others, to being a victim to our possessions and greed. As Brian McLaren says, in the seventh story, humans are participants in the biggest thing that has ever happened, of the evolution of the good, of the expansion of the consciousness to include the healing of all things. Even when our group or nation rejects the seventh story, that story remains alive, inspiring more and more in each generation. So consider, as you have listened today, where the first six stories live in your life and how you might undermine them, learn from them, and turn instead to the seventh story. Consider how you can act to bring more love, justice, and peace to the world. And consider how the power of story can help us all to learn what it is that we want to choose, how we choose to live, and to stay focused on that choice. For those of you who are watching on video, we invite you to join us some Sunday for a more participative experience. You can find out more about our ethical society at rysec.org.